the amazing thing about a studio practice is, you know, it keeps going. And a lot of us are kind of interested in the same foundational things throughout our life, but what that looks like continues to change if you keep like nurturing it. So yeah, just paint and pay attention.
Jenna, welcome. Thank you
Hi.
so much for being part of this virtual artist studio tour that we are doing in this strange time that we're all living in. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you're living now.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Well, you're speaking to me now in my bedroom in Brooklyn. And so this is now my office space, my studio space, my workout space. It's my everything space. And it's not too far from where I was born. I grew up in Long Island on the South Shore near JFK. And then I moved to Brandeis right after high school. And so I lived in Boston a little bit after Brandeis. I did both the major in fine arts studio and art history together and the post-bac program for a year. And then I went to Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, where I lived for 4 years about total. And during that time, I worked at the Rose Art Museum when I was at Brandeis, and I worked at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia after grad school. And then when I moved to New York in 2012, I started working at the Jewish Museum shortly after that. So I've always had career in museums and also studio practice together.
Tell me a little bit about what that kind of connection between working in the museums and the studio practice, you know, how they go hand in hand for you.
So in my studio practice, part of, I think, what's been a journey for me is the Jewish part of that, because I work at a Jewish institution or we're an art museum and a cultural institution, and what that, sometimes it's been, an interesting question of what my work is about, what the source material is, the reference material. I would say I make non-representational paintings, but sometimes they come from representational source material. So there's a lot in my studio practice that involves just kind of collecting found material, patterns, images, and kind of combining these things all together. And sometimes the personal references like peek their way through. And that's something, that I don't always think I was super interested in or comfortable with when I was younger, but I've kind of like now come to just accept it as like all part of like the mush togetherness of what my life and identity is.
In terms of your studio, are there kind of artists that influence you, or special pieces maybe by friends or artists that you like to keep around? Just, I know in my own studio, like I always have my favorite people that I have like a little piece by that I got over the years.
It's definitely like the trades and the friend work that I have both like, up behind me, there's like a screen print and marble by Cheryl Oppenheim, who's another Brandeis alum. In my living room, there's a painting by Nomi Saffron Hahn, who's another friend of mine from college. So, I know that Brandeis people are going to watch this, so those friendships run deep. And for people from grad school too, definitely in my studio. My studio is in Brooklyn. Normally, it's in the Brooklyn Army Terminal. I tend to think about influences in the work like early 20th century, like collage, Matisse, like big one, and then like women abstract expressionist painters are another like favorite of mine. But in the studio, and my house, I try to have work from friends. And my partner's a photographer. So I think the two of us have kind of like amalgamated this collection of work together from people we know.
That's great. Yeah, I love me having collections and, gathering work from friends and teachers and people along the journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes a huge difference as a working artist.
I had been for a little while, like the past couple of years, I'd been making like wall collages where I kind of assemble like a flattened still life on the wall. So I'll pin up like wallpaper or like vinyl or something that I find. And then there'll be some sort of like low relief sculpture with maybe some found object like ceramic or a piece of wood or a postcard and wrapping paper, some, like things like that kind of like have a bit of randomness to them. And so I've been making, in a way, like sometimes very representational, like observational paintings of those things, while I'm always also making like drawings of them and collages of them and kind of like trying to reduce what I'm looking at into very more simple elements. And so there's kind of like a cycle that will happen where I might make a collage version of something, and then like the negative shape from a piece of paper that I cut becomes like more important to me than what I was actually looking at when I started making it. And then that will kind of like kick off the next phase of working. So I'm working both in oil paint usually when I'm in my studio in Brooklyn. This is my studio right now, is on a tabletop in my bedroom. And this is a painting that I brought home with me that I was working on at the end of February and the beginning of March. So I took it here to finish it. And it's on wood panel made with acrylic and tape. So it comes from a real source, but again, it's like a really reduced version of what the original source material was. And I've just been doing some very small work on paper here. I've been making, these are cards, but they're, these are kind of like really, really simple, like line and stencil work. I love stencils. I usually use a lot of stencils. My stencils that I've been making here are really rudimentary and simple, but I love stencils because it's like the positive and the negative happen together. So it's kind of this like immediate satisfaction. And this is my box of supplies, that basically everything I brought home from my studio is in that box. And then those 2 bags are knitting material. And I also have a knitting practice, which is like, you know, aside from my studio practice, something that I've been doing for a long time, but I was thinking about how there's something in the way that I work in the studio where, especially when things are just left to develop their own narrative and you might not really know what's gonna happen when you start a piece or a project, the knitting is kind of the opposite, because it's like you follow a pattern and you have a planned outcome, and you can only do something like a certain rhythm or a certain rate, speed. So I kind of enjoy that I have both of those experiences happening together, at least in my domestic space right now.
What's one thing that you need in your studio at all times, and why?
I was thinking about things that I need in my studio, and whenever I set up a new studio, I've been in the same building. I've had my studio in the same building since 2011. Now the longest I've ever had a studio in one place, which is kind of miraculous in New York and in general. But I always put up a few kind of like signpost things for myself to like claim a space, you know, as a space that I want to work in, or like know that I have some intentionality behind working in. And one example comes actually from Brandeis, from the building at Prospect Street, which I know is not the studio building anymore. But I inherited someone's studio when I was a postback, and on the walls they had written paint, the words paint and pay attention. And I thought those were just like some imaginary to-do list that like who knew who wrote it and when. But I brought it even like to this desk on this piece of paper.
I'm going to spotlight it.
So that, you know, it's like a little reminder that this is also my studio right now. And yeah, take it however you want. And aside from that, I also, you know, books, like art books, and like my iPod are pretty important in my studio.
That's awesome.